And I'm suggesting very strongly that the Republicans, in going for the Save America Act, that you weld it into exactly this, because voter ID is part of Homeland Security. Think of it. We're talking about two separate items, but they're really the same. Voter ID is part of Homeland Security. And citizenship, proof of citizenship, is part of Homeland Security. So I think it should be welded in. I think it should be together. You should vote together, because the public has not liked what they've done at the airports. And they've done it, and the public understands it. They've gotten wise to it. Republicans do not settle with Democrats and let them out of this hole that they've buried themselves in. You have to take the votes in the Senate to approve. You need votes to approve. We have to get Democrat votes. And at a certain point, if you could get rid of the filibuster, it would be great. It would be great. Get rid of the filibuster and get it all done.
Donald Trump's newest attack on his own Republican Party is not just another moment of frustration. It looks like a full political breakdown, and it reveals three major truths about the upcoming midterms. First, Trump and Republicans clearly understand that the political landscape is shifting against them, which is why aggressive efforts to redraw power through gerrymandering are becoming more visible. Second, Trump does not appear to care about the Republican Party's broader success as much as he claims, because if winning the midterms were truly his top priority, publicly attacking Republican senators would make very little sense. And third, what seems to disturb Trump most is not simply the possibility of Republicans losing the House or Senate. What truly threatens him is what those defeats would say about his influence, his political control, and his grip over the Republican Party. That is why his frustration is now turning inward toward MAGA itself. Now let's examine the report showing how Republicans are attempting to fund Trump's White House project while presenting it as a security issue.
There was pushback from Senate Republicans yesterday in the conference meeting about the cost of the ballroom, which has ballooned to about $1 billion for the security aspect. Is there an IG, either for GSA or the Treasury, who would or should be eyeballing that project? And how do we make sure it doesn't balloon like some of these other government spending building projects?
Well, I'm sure because of the nature of the project, you're going to have inspector generals who look at this, who look at the auditing, who look at the accounting, who make sure that this is done in a good way. I will say the President of the United States is a very good builder, and the reason why this is expensive is not because of the ballroom. The reason this is expensive is because of the security precautions necessary, things that have nothing to do with the ballroom itself, but have to do with the actual security infrastructure on the White House.
Before getting into Trump's attacks on Senate Republicans over the SAVE Act, we need to focus on what Republicans are quietly pushing forward, because this alone is enough to spark outrage before even reaching Trump's latest political explosion. Senate Republicans are moving a proposal involving $1 billion in White House security funding, and the obvious question is whether this is truly about national security or whether it is indirectly helping fund Trump's ballroom project. Republicans insist the proposal is only for security-related construction and not for the ballroom itself. But the White House appears to frame the issue differently. Senator Chuck Grassley, chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, outlined funding for security improvements linked to the East Wing Modernization Project, which is the administration's term for the massive 90,000-square-foot East Wing rebuild after Trump tore it down last year. The legislative language says the money is for above-ground and underground security infrastructure that has not been fully explained by the administration. It also explicitly says the funding cannot be used for non-security parts of the project, which clearly points toward Trump's ballroom plans. This next part shows why Trump's anger over the SAVE Act is becoming a bigger issue inside Republican-friendly media.
The change that I was expecting from the president himself, I don't feel in my everyday life, which is concerning to me. I still feel, obviously, that, prices are very, very, very high. If you're going to the grocery store or just in general, because inflation still exists. Unfortunately, now we have the higher gas prices, which really hurt, everyday people in their pocket.
But let's be realistic. Republicans are packaging this as national security because they understand how terrible it would look to openly fund what appears to be a personal vanity project. It is the same political theater seen after the White House Correspondents' Dinner, when they tried to describe the ballroom as a safety necessity rather than a personal monument. But few people seriously believe Republicans are not searching for a way to eventually fund the entire thing. They have already shown how eager they are to turn the ballroom into a political talking point, especially after other controversies made their position harder to defend. Trump is not truly furious with Republicans over the ballroom because they are not actually blocking him there. What has really angered him is the SAVE Act. Trump is upset because Senate Republicans are resisting the exact path he wants, and even Republican voters are beginning to show signs of frustration with him. Now watch how Trump pressures Republicans to kill the filibuster.
I think the Senate has to approve it. I really do. I think, and they're going to have to go to the filibuster, and maybe it's going to be the talking filibuster like the old days. The great Jimmy Stewart, right? Remember the great movie, Jimmy Stewart? But they have to get it done, because if we don't get this done, if it takes you 6 months, I'm for not approving anything.
As you just heard, President Trump is ramping up his pressure on the Senate to use the filibuster to pass the Save America Act, a law that would enact sweeping voting reforms. But the Senate's Republican leadership is standing their ground against the president.
That is why cracks are now becoming visible inside the party, even in media spaces usually friendly to Trump. When even Fox's selected voters begin suggesting Trump is making mistakes, it signals a real political problem. These are not random anti-Trump critics. These are the type of voters selected because they are expected to represent a favorable audience. So if even they are expressing frustration, Trump's midterm position looks genuinely vulnerable. That is why Trump is now pushing Republicans to abolish the filibuster while attacking them for not helping force the SAVE Act through. In the Oval Office, he criticized members of his own party and essentially painted Senate Republicans as weak or foolish for refusing to immediately fall in line. Here is where Thomas Massie's race becomes a serious test of Trump's control.
It's because they want everybody else to go along, to get along. And if they let one guy come up here and vote his conscience and vote the way he campaigned and vote for his constituents instead of rubber stamping the party menu that day, then there might be others who are encouraged to do that. And so that's why I'm fighting so hard. This is a fight worth winning. It's a national referendum. There'll be international cameras at my election day victory party because it has ramifications.
But the most revealing detail was not simply that Trump attacked Republicans. It was his insistence that he has 100% approval with MAGA. That claim does not match reality. Reports suggest the opposite. Trump appears to be losing support not only among ordinary Republican voters, but even among people who traditionally considered themselves loyal MAGA supporters. That is why figures like Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Megyn, and Candace Owens generate so much attention whenever they offer even mild criticism of the administration. There is now a growing audience inside conservative politics that wants to see Trump challenged. So when Trump claims he has complete approval among Republicans, what he may actually be revealing is insecurity. Now let's see how Republicans are starting to imagine life after Trump.
This is really a proxy question about the future of the Republican Party. Right? That's really what we're talking about here. And J.D. Vance has that base appeal, in part because he's sort of inheriting it from Trump himself, that he is closer to the group of people which sort of drive what the base is motivated by. Rubio, it's not surprising that he plays better in a room of Republican donors and Mar-a-Lago donors or Doral donors or wherever it is, because that's sort of the angle that he's always been sort of the more establishment guy. And so this is really the question. And I think the question of who Donald Trump endorses between them, that's going to come down to whoever's leading Donald Trump thinks is going to win. Because the core thing for Donald Trump is he wants to be seen as the kingmaker, and so he waits to see who's going to be the king before he makes a lot of these endorsements. So that's going to leave unresolved, though, what the future of the party actually is.
He fears public signs of weakness, especially in races like Thomas Massie's primary battle. Trump is watching tens of millions of dollars being poured into defeating Massie, combined with his own endorsement and campaign appearances for Massie's challenger. If Massie survives all of that pressure, it would send a dangerous message for Trump, that he no longer has absolute control over the Republican Party. It would show that Republicans do not automatically follow his orders anymore. It would suggest that his endorsements may no longer carry the same political force they once did. That is the bigger story unfolding here. Republicans are starting to imagine a future beyond Trump. Some are focused on surviving the midterms, while others are already looking ahead to 2028 and what the Republican Party becomes after him. This section explains why the SAVE Act is about loyalty as much as voting. For the first time in a long while, creating distance from Trump is becoming a realistic political path inside the GOP. In the past, only a few Republicans like Lisa Murkowski or Susan Collins would occasionally appear willing to break away from him. But now that political lane is becoming more stable. A growing coalition of Republican voters and conservative media voices is becoming more comfortable criticizing Trump, especially when they believe he is damaging the party's future. Trump's obsession with the SAVE Act is not just about making voting more difficult before the midterms. It is also about proving that Republicans still answer to him. He wants to demonstrate that he can still punish members of his own party if they step out of line. Now watch why Democrats are being warned not to make the easy mistake. That has long been his political method: fear, pressure, and political retaliation to maintain obedience. But the fact that he now has to fight so aggressively to enforce that loyalty suggests his grip is weakening. The SAVE Act itself remains central to this entire story, because critics argue it functions as a mechanism to make voting harder. The justification behind it has been heavily challenged, and Jessica Tarlov was right to highlight those concerns. The legislation presents itself as election security, while critics argue it creates barriers at the polls. Republicans understand that if persuasion becomes harder, making voting more difficult can become another path to victory. That is why Trump appears so angry. The midterms are approaching. His approval numbers are shaky, his party is nervous, and his traditional ability to control Republican lawmakers is not working the way it once did. Here is where the anti-establishment argument becomes bigger than Trump. But Democrats should not make the mistake of assuming that simply opposing Trump is enough. Being anti-Trump may be enough to flip the House because frustration with him is already significant. If Democrats only ran on the message that Trump is dangerous, they could likely still make gains. But the Senate is a different challenge, and voters may want more than simple opposition. Democrats need a larger, bolder, more future-focused vision. They need a message that matches the moral clarity many voters feel while speaking directly to demands for meaningful systemic change. That is why the moment at the University of Michigan graduation matters. A professor spoke openly about what is happening, and even without using the word genocide, the university reportedly punished him. Finally, this shows the fracture opening inside the Republican Party. That reflects exactly the kind of institutional behavior Democrats may need to challenge. Not only Trump, not only MAGA, but broader institutions that silence uncomfortable truths, protect power, and punish moral clarity. This was an anti-establishment political environment, and Democrats should understand that energy. They should position themselves not only against Trump, but against systems that silence people and defend entrenched power. That is the political lane that can actually move voters. Not merely anti-Trump, but anti-establishment. Not simply resistance to one man, but a larger fight against structures that protect the powerful while silencing ordinary voices. Trump's meltdown suggests Republicans are scared. His attacks on his own party suggest his control is weakening. His fixation on the SAVE Act suggests he knows the midterms could be dangerous. But Democrats cannot simply stand back and wait for Trump to implode. They need to offer a real alternative that feels bold, honest, and ready to challenge the institutions that failed voters. So keep watching this battle closely. Trump is attacking Republicans because he feels his political grip slipping. Republicans are trying to fund Trump's projects while framing it as security. The SAVE Act remains a flashpoint over voting rights and party loyalty. And inside the Republican Party, a real fracture appears to be opening between loyalty to Trump and political survival. The midterms are approaching fast, and the biggest question is whether Democrats will only run against Trump or whether they will also challenge the broken political establishment that helped create this moment.